Weymouth and the Associated Citizens Group like to call its next witness. Oh,
We're going through the counting exercise to make sure we never forget anyone. Yeah, we're done.
you're done.
We're done.
Okay, I think that turns us over to the town of Braintree.
Town of Braintree would like to call Dr. Dockery. Rothschild, procedural matter before we begin. Dr. Dockery has to leave around 1 o'clock for the doctor's appointment, and I've discussed this with counsel for Algonquin and department. If we could continue with his testimony until it's done, rather than taking a lunch break around 12, as we did yesterday, that's what we would like.
That's right. If that's acceptable to all the parties, then that is acceptable to me.
It is to the applicant and to the trial.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Dockery.
Good morning.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good morning, sir. Would you state your name for the record, please?
Douglas William Dockery.
And what is your business address?
My business address is the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, 401 Park Drive in Boston.
And that is, what is your position at the School of Public Health?
I'm a research professor of environmental epidemiology.
You have a copy. Did you prepare pre-filed testimony on behalf of Braintree in this matter?
I do. I have a copy in front of me.
Were you compensated for preparing that testimony?
I was not.
Did you sign that testimony under the Pays and Penalties of Perjury?
I did.
Do you have any corrections that you wish to make to that testimony before it's offered into?
Yes, please. I'd like to make some corrections. I want to thank my colleague Peter Goldberg for pointing out some typos. On paragraph 42, line 4, where it says TEL, that's a typo. It should be AAL.
You hold on a second while we all get there.
Let's see, that's on page.
Okay.
Could you repeat the paragraph number, please?
Sure. Let me see if I can. So on page 15, paragraph 42, line 4, at the end of the line, where it says TEL, I meant to say AAL. On the following paragraph, 43, in the last line, the first word is 14 days, and it should be 19 days. And the effect of that on the next page of the...
I'm just going to correct, so it should say 7 of 19 days?
Right. And so on the next page, paragraph 45, on the third line, the beginning of the line, it says, on half of the monitored days, that should be a third of the monitoring days then.
That's the last line of page 15, correct?
The last line of paragraph 45.
So it should say on 1/3?
I'm not, I'm sorry, the third line of paragraph 45 is 1/3.
Anything else?
No, thank you.
So with those corrections, you adopt what was your testimony?
Indeed, I do.
The offer this testimony.
Okay, Dr. Dockery is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Dockery.
Good morning, Mr. Hayden.
Cramb.
Great. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. My name is Nick Cramb. I represent the applicant in this proceeding. Thank you for the corrections to your testimony. You signed your testimony under the Pains and Penalties of Perjury, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what does that mean to you?
It means I'm speaking the truth with, to the best of my knowledge, based on my professional experience.
And does it reflect that you took an appropriate amount of time to ensure that the testimony, but for the minor corrections you just made, was accurate?
Yes.
And
I
complete.
took more time than I expected, but thank you.
And
Thank
then
you
it
for your concern.
completely stated your opinions.
Yes,
And you chose the words that you used in your testimony carefully, correct?
yes,
And it was reviewed by counsel before you submitted it, correct?
yes.
Did you identify the materials that you reviewed in connection with preparing your testimony in the writing?
I referenced the materials I used as a basis for the statements and the conclusions I read. But, you know, in my experience, I mean, it's based on my professional experience and based on, you know, reading many, many documents in preparation for this, and also they're reading other parts of the materials here which were not specifically cited as part of my testimony.
So I think there are two parts there. You said that you reviewed many, many documents in order to prepare to testify in this proceeding. Is that correct?
I mean, in my professional experience, I've reviewed many, many documents.
Just over the span of your
Over the
career,
span of my career.
not
So
specific.
in this
One at a
case,
time, please.
Go ahead.
and in this case, I mean, there's a lot of the basic documents for the application are reviewed, but have not specifically cited.
Okay, so putting aside the many documents that you've reviewed over the span of your career that were not specific to this particular assignment, could you please explain what you did review that was specific to forming the opinions that are set forth in your written testimony and the work that you did in this case that are not identified in your written testimony?
By that I'm meaning the original application and some of the other base documents.
Like what?
I mean, for the original application, for example.
Besides the application, did you review anything else in connection with preparing your testimony and forming your opinions in this case?
Not that I could quote specifically.
But you believe that there were other documents that you reviewed?
I'm sure I read other documents.
And those have not, whatever it was that you reviewed, provided to the applicant, is that correct?
They were within the basic package of documents that I received from the applicant.
You received documents from the applicant?
Well, look for them, we received a file of all the documents that have been submitted as part of the process.
Okay. So the materials that you reviewed are materials that have been filed with the Department of Environmental Protection in connection with this, with the application that brought us here today.
Right.
Is that fair? Okay. Are there any other materials that you reviewed or considered outside of those in connection with forming your opinions in this case?
No, but
Other than
for
those
this-
that are specifically referenced here
for these.
or that were filed with the DEP in this proceeding?
And of course, I've looked at the testimony that's been submitted since then.
Okay. By other parties in this proceeding?
Right.
Thank you. So your testimony covers two different topics. One relates to air pollution modeling, and the other relates to evaluating air toxic and air pollutant exposures. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your air pollution modeling testimony, and my colleague is going to follow up, Mr. Child, with some questions about the exposure testimony. Okay?
Yes.
In citing to the EPA's guideline on air quality models, do you agree that this is in paragraph 12 of your testimony, that for a wide range of regulatory applications in all types of terrains, the EPA recommended model is AirMod?
That's what it states.
Okay, and you agree with that?
Yes.
In paragraphs 12 and 13, you quote a 2011 edition of the EPA's guideline on air quality models.
Yes.
Is that correct? Did you know that the guideline has been updated and amended?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I was using the same one that was cited in the application by the,
I'm not sure that's right, but let's take a look. May I approach?
You may.
Please mark that for identification.
oops,
Do you recognize the document that's been marked for identification?
yes.
And what is this?
This is Federal Register guidelines for air quality models. So this is indeed an update from January 17th, 2017.
Okay. And you see the title of this document is Revisions to the Guideline on Air Quality Models.
Yes.
And do you see below that in the leftmost column that this is a final rule action?
I don't see it specifically, but I believe you.
Well, take a look. Right, it's in the top quartermost section of the page, in the leftmost column. Below the title, it says agency, it has the EPA, and then action. I think you've gone past it.
Yeah.
Would it be helpful if I called your attention to it?
I'm willing to concede that.
Okay. I think it would be helpful for the record,
Okay.
if you don't mind. May I approach?
You may.
I'm just gonna point to it. You see right here where it says action?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was easier. Thank you.
Sure.
So it's a final rule.
Okay. And then, so do you have an understanding that this is a more recent version of the EPA's guideline on air quality models than the one that you cited in your report?
Yes.
I'd like to offer that that be admitted, or ask that that be admitted into the record.
Any objection? That's admitted.
In paragraph 13 of your testimony, you cited a section of the old guideline, section 728, titled Complex Winds.
Right.
And this discusses fumigation, correct?
Right.
And the language that you've quoted explains that fumigation can be an important phenomenon. Do you see that? It's in the first.
I didn't explain it. That's what it says.
Okay.
In the document.
You quoted it.
Right.
Thank you. Good clarification. And a bit lower down, the language that you quoted says that when fumigation conditions are expected to occur from a source or sources with tall stacks, this should be addressed in the air quality modeling analysis, right?
Yes.
And then it references something called the shoreline dispersion model.
Yes.
Can I now call your attention to the updated version of the guideline
Yes, please do.
and section 7.2.1.2. Let's see if I can help you get there as well. So there are page numbers on the upper left-hand corner
Right.
of each page, and the section that I'd like to take a look at is on page 5216. I think. Yes.
Thank you.
And then do you see that in the very middle of that page, both from the sides and the top and the bottom, there's a section 7.2.1.2 title.
Complex winds.
Right. Okay. And I will tell you that this is very similar to the language that you quoted, but there are some differences, so I just want to walk you through them.
Okay.
That's okay. In section Roman numeral 2, little 2,
Shoreline
following.
fumigation.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep, nope, you're right, but so shoreline fumigation, you're actually ahead of me. Here this explains a few things. It says that fumigation can be an important phenomenon on or near the shoreline of bodies of water, correct? And that it can affect both, I'm sorry, you have to answer verbally. Did I get that?
I'm sorry.
That's-
Yes,
I did get that correct?
yes,
And it explains that this can affect both individual plumes and area-wide emissions, correct?
yes,
And then when fumigation conditions are expected to occur from a source or sources with tall stacks located on or just inland of a shoreline, this should be addressed in the air quality modeling analysis, correct?
yes,
All right, and that's very similar to the language that we looked at in the version that you quoted in your testimony, right?
indeed.
Okay. But then a little further down, it says that selection of the appropriate model for applications where shoreline fumigation is of concern should be determined in consultation with the appropriate reviewing authority. See that?
Yes,
Okay. And there's no longer a reference to the shoreline dispersion model there, correct?
right.
All right, now focusing in on some of the language that we just looked at, could you explain to me what a tall stack is within the meaning of the guidance?
In this case, it refers, I think the language here is a little ambiguous in that the concept is that you have a emission above the level of the internal boundary layer on the shoreline, so that it includes the stack. You have the stack height, plus you have the plume height, which is actually where the plume emissions end up vertically, and that's determined by the stack height plus the vertical exit velocity of the emissions plus the buoyancy effects. And so there is a difference here between stack height and plume height. And so the physical concept that's important is where the plume is compared to the level of the mixing layer, the internal boundary layer.
Okay.
So in this case, it's referring to the comparative tallness, the effective tallness of the stack based on the plume height.
So I think what you're saying is that tall stack doesn't refer just to the stack, but to the height of all of the three things that you just mentioned, both the stack itself, the exhaust rate that the plume leaves the stack from, and the buoyancy, which is impacted by temperature. Is that right?
Yes, effectively.
And at what point is a stack, including those things, tall as opposed to not tall?
So for the fumigation issues, it's, as I said, you have a internal boundary layer being established as the air moves in on the sea breeze conditions over the hot land, and initially starts at zero and builds up to higher and higher levels as you move inland. And so the question is the place where the stack is located relative to the depth of that internal boundary layer, at that point is this effective height of the stack above the internal boundary layer.
I see. So whether or not something constitutes a tall stack within the meaning of the guidance depends on the location of the boundary layer. Is that correct?
The height of the boundary layer.
The height. And you have not, in your testimony, calculated the height of the boundary layer that may be or may not be near the site of the proposed compressor station, correct?
It's a dynamic process, so it changes day to day and during the day.
And you have not taken
I have not.
measurements or analyzed the, where the height of the boundary layer may be at any given time, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you do not opine in your written testimony that fumigations are expected to occur at the site of the proposed compressor station, correct?
I would suggest that this is an important factor, and I think that was the intent of my wording, trying to be as careful as I could, that I think this is an issue that needs to be considered, especially in the context of the guidance that was provided and modeling by the EPA in these Federal Register documents.
Okay, well, actually, if you look at your testimony, and I think it's in paragraph 11, the second to last sentence says that under sea breeze conditions, the plume can be carried inland aloft, largely intact, before being brought down to the ground in a process known as sea breeze fumigation, correct?
Yes,
You're recognizing the possibility of this phenomenon in paragraph 11, correct?
yes,
Okay. And you haven't actually done measurements of the boundary layer, for example, that may be necessary to determine whether or not fumigation is actually likely at the specific site, correct?
I have not made direct measurements of that. On the other hand, based on my professional experience, I would expect this to be a phenomenon that occurs regularly.
But you have not actually studied or analyzed the specific conditions at the site of the proposed compressor station, correct?
I've not been sitting at the compression station watching for this to occur, no.
And you have not analyzed records related to weather conditions, temperatures, or wind, for example, at the site of the proposed compressor station?
No.
And if you look back at the guideline, and we'll stay on the new one, it does explain that, quote, fumigation can be an important phenomenon, correct?
Yes,
And it says that fumigation can affect both individual plumes and area-wide emissions, correct?
yes,
And you had said in your testimony that fumigation can occur, correct?
yes.
Okay. In paragraphs 15 through 21 of your testimony,
Mhm.
I believe what you're suggesting is that the applicant should not have used the rural option in its modeling analysis. Is that correct?
There, in regard to the urban-rural issue, there, as I understand it, there are two issues here. The basic characteristics of determining these surface characteristics of the surface roughness, albedo and the Bowen's ratio, and these are based on overall characteristics of the area being considered. And then secondly, there are specific inputs for those parameters based on the wind direction. And so in this, I think there's been clarified by Mr. Pacheco in his testimony, in his rebuttal testimony, of how that was done. And I would agree that for the overall characterization of the area, that the rural characterization appears appropriate. And then likewise, in thinking about the direction-specific characterization, it became clear reading that testimony that there was a consideration of looking at the upwind characteristics, the surface roughness and so forth, in 30-degree segments when the model was applied. And I think that is appropriate also.
One of the other things that you testified about in paragraph 22 is that you recognize that the applicants and its consultant, Trinity, used weather data from Logan Airport in connection with this modeling, correct?
Right.
And you recognize that that data provides an excellent representation of the surface meteorological conditions at the site, correct?
I think that was the best data available.
And that data from Logan Airport would include data about sea breezes, correct?
It would include data defining when the wind direction would be coming off the sea, off the water. So I'm looking at that dimension of this. The reason I differentiate this is, when you think about the atmosphere, it's three-dimensional. So we have the surface, looking at the wind direction, the wind speed, temperature, and so forth at the surface. But there's also the vertical dimension, and that's the other important characteristic.
Okay, but look,
So as I said, I was careful to say for the surface characteristics, I think the Logan is a very good representation.
including surface level sea breezes, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. And in fact, one of the other things that you cite in that paragraph is a study that showed that there were 309 days of sea breeze over a 10-year period at Logan Airport, correct?
Yes.
You do criticize Trinity for using vertical structure weather data from Gray, Maine, correct?
I'm not sure I would say I'm criticizing. I'm saying it fails to incorporate the Gray, Maine data is a representation of the vertical structure of the atmosphere over the whole region. And I would agree, is the best representation for the mesoscale, the New England vertical structure. But it fails to capture the microstructure near the shoreline here as that internal boundary layer develops. So the Gray site is, I mentioned, and has been discussed in previous, is about 10 miles inland. So it does capture, does experience presumably the sea breeze at times, but 10 miles in does not represent the depth of the internal boundary layer at the shoreline or at places close to the shoreline like the site we're talking about.
And is there another existing vertical structure weather data set that's available that, in your opinion, could have been used here?
No, I think this is, appropriate. I mean, the other option is to use the models that now have the sea breeze fumigation built into them as a way of evaluating the situation.
And to be clear, what the EPA has said about that is when fumigations are expected to occur from a source with a tall stack, it should be addressed in an air quality modeling analysis, correct?
Right.
Okay. And further, that if you were to select a model other than AirMod, that was something that you'd have to work out in consultation with the reviewing authority, correct?
Right.
Thank you. I have no further questions for you. Thank you very much for testimony. My colleague does.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you mind if I stand as I have before? Thank you very much. I would refer you to paragraph 25 of your testimony.
Yes.
And in this paragraph, you challenge the way the department evaluated the impacts of emissions of air pollutants at the compressor station as a single source, correct?
Yes.
Specifically, you stated that the department did so without consideration of other sources or background air concentration, right?
Yes.
Actually, of course, the department did do that with respect to criteria air pollutants, right?
Right.
As you describe in paragraph 31 to 35.
Yes.
So your statement in paragraph 25 is a little broad, isn't it?
And yes, I guess that's true in the sense that it does not, I was thinking about the toxic air pollutants.
Right, so your actual testimony only really is referring to the single source evaluation of air pollutants that are toxic, right?
Thank you for that clarification.
And actually, in paragraph 31 to 35, in describing the way the applicant or attorney handled criteria air pollutants, you had no criticism of the way that was done, right? Other than your comments on the model.
Right, I think this is, this is where most of my experience is, and I have no criticism of that.
Most of your experience, in fact, is with criteria air pollutants.
Indeed.
Indeed, most of your research and your wonderful reputation is based on research on particular materials, right?
Yes.
I think all of us in the room admire that. I've been an environmental lawyer for a long time. The reduction in PM levels is largely on work done in OPEC. Over here, you're talking about air toxins, right?
Oh. Thank you. Yes, with regard to air toxins.
Now, if you could refer to paragraph 26.
Yes.
And here you acknowledge that in setting the TELs, the department, in fact, did take into account that people may be exposed to a chemical from sources other than an individual air source, correct?
Yes, there's an assumption there that these exposures come from multiple sources.
This is the relative source contribution
Right.
that we referred to before. So I understand your criticism is that in applying the TELs and EELs, the department did not do a particular comparison in the way you would like of the exceedances in the neighborhood and the plant against the AELs and TELs. Correct? That's what you're criticizing. They didn't do that, correct?
That was a little obtuse.
You're right. Let me rephrase that part. Let me just say this. I think you already said this. In setting the TELs and then picking the number, they did in fact consider other exposures, correct?
Right.
It's in the application of the TELs that you have your criticism.
Yes.
And in paragraph 41, if I refer you to that.
Yes.
In the second sentence, starting with that there is no differentiation. There you acknowledge that the department also took other exposures into account in setting the standards for AAOs, correct?
Yes.
So in setting the standards, both AAOs and TELs, the department recognized that there are other exposures occurring, right?
I think that's a fair statement, yes.
And returning to paragraph 26. Your final sentence says the TELs for ambient air limit. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that to get the grammar more correct. The TELs for ambient air limit total chemical exposure, correct?
Total, sorry.
Chemical exposures.
That's what it says, yes.
Could you explain to me how the TELs limit total chemical exposures?
They establish limits that, and these are guidelines as I understand it, that the department uses for evaluating the, whether there's an acceptable risk from these chemical exposures, ambient chemical exposures.
So by use of the word limits by you, you recognize that they're not legally binding enforceable standards, are they?
That's my understanding, yes.
Unlike, for example, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which actually are enforceable limits, right?
Exactly.
Whereas the AALs and TELs are guidelines, as you said, that DEP uses in evaluating projected emissions from a particular facility, right?
Yes.
But they're not enforceable limits in the same way as the NACs, correct?
I mean, you're asking me to opine on regulatory and legal issues that I'm not qualified, but in my interpretation of that, yes, the state is, the Mass DEP has established these guidelines that they use in evaluating permits and other regulatory actions.
Whereas, for example, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards were actually promulgated by EPA as regulations.
Mm.
And you may not know this, but
Yes.
DEP has adopted them in regulations as well.
Yes.
Refer to paragraph 29.
There.
And you state there that you were not able to find documentation or example of Mass DEP's, quote, long-standing protocol, quote, quote, referenced above, right?
Right.
And that, quote, the long-standing protocol refers to Mass DEP's statement in its response to comments that were given on a draft version of this term, where DEP used that term in describing why they only evaluated facility-specific air toxic emissions, correct?
Correct.
Do you disagree that that has been DEP's long-standing protocol?
In reviewing subsequent testimony and submissions, I mean, in looking back, I continually found this language of longstanding policy, but could not find the policy, and eventually found that in 1989 there was a statement of what this policy was. I don't have the specific document cited here, but you're probably well aware of what it is, stating that there is this policy of evaluating only the incremental effect. On the other hand, I've still not found the justification or scientific rationale for the basis for that policy.
All right, but you don't deny that that has been its policy and the way they have done air permitting in Massachusetts?
I will agree that that has been apparently the policy since 1989.
And you found no examples where Mass DEP has done it any other way, have you?
No.
Later in that paragraph, you state that this protocol is not consistent with the science discussed above, that all airborne exposure to chemicals are additive to contribute to death and health risks, correct?
Right.
Could you show me where you had discussed that above in your testimony?
When I discussed the RSC, for example, in the concept that there's no reason to differentiate exposures to these toxic chemicals from outdoor airborne exposure, that those are somehow different from exposures from indoor airborne exposures, or different from waterborne exposures, or different from food exposures, or any other source of exposures.
Well, in fact, you didn't say that in your pre-product.
Did I say that explicitly?
Well, it's your sentence, the science discussed above, and I looked at the prior paragraph, and there's nothing there.
Not in that immediate, but in when I talked earlier on in, let's see. Paragraph 26, talking about these multiple pathways. And likewise, in talking about the experience with the criteria air pollutants, I think there's some inconsistency here when you look at the criteria air pollutant evaluation, where we do look at the total ambient levels concerning all the sources of exposure and whether that leads to a violation of a level above the standard.
I understand the testimony you provided. What I was looking for was a discussion of the science, and I see a few statements, but I don't actually see any discussion of the science in your testimony. Correct?
Yeah, I think I would accept that there's not a explicit, definite discussion of the science there.
Turning to paragraph 42.
Yes.
There you note that DEP has measured existing levels of formaldehyde at levels above the AELs in Boston, correct?
Right.
And Lynn
Yes.
and Weymouth.
Yes.
And then in paragraph 43, you testify that DEP has measured existing levels of benzene at levels above the AAL in Boston
Yes.
and Lynn,
Yes.
but not in Weymouth, right?
Right.
Then turning to paragraph 45, at the top of page 16. Are you there?
Yes.
You state that these levels of VOCs jointly produce an unacceptable cancer risk. That's your testimony, right?
Yes.
When you say unacceptable cancer risk, what do you mean by that? At this location?
That we've defined an acceptable cancer risk as 1 in a million over a lifetime. We had a discussion about that yesterday. So based on that acceptable risk, then the TELs and AALs were developed to provide a guidance for when we would exceed those values. And given that, based on those guidelines, the observed concentrations in Weymouth are above those guidelines.
But not for benzene.
But I think that's true.
Well, you disagreed with me.
Yeah.
Your testimony was
Yeah.
that the data do not show exceedance of the AALs for benzene and Weymouth.
Okay,
So those are actually within the 100 million guideline.
yes.
Have you calculated for the reported values in Weymouth that are above the AALs, what the actual risk is for exposure to those levels of formaldehyde?
No, I've not attempted that.
Have you calculated any added risk from the incremental contribution of formaldehyde to the atmosphere in Weymouth?
No, I have not.
Or benzene?
No.
Your view about unacceptable cancer risk would apply as well to residents of Boston, correct?
Yes,
And Lynn,
yes.
most urban areas of America, correct?
I'm not familiar with the data in most urban areas, but I wouldn't be surprised.
And that's because both benzene and formaldehyde are ubiquitous compounds that
Yes.
we're all exposed to in urban areas all the time,
Yes,
correct?
yes,
And most likely at levels above the DEP AALs, correct?
yes.
So all of us are in fact accepting an unacceptable cancer risk, correct?
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, what do we mean by, how do we define what this is that's acceptable or not acceptable?
Well, that's correct, but
Could I ask that he be allowed to finish his
One second.
response?
I mean,
did I step on you?
you know, there are, as we've been discussing these things, there are different levels of acceptability depending on the sources. For example, smoking, for example, we know has exposures to various toxic chemicals and at much higher levels than 1 in a million. But those types of personal behaviors, we're willing to accept a higher risk associated with those. On the other hand, when you're exposed to these toxic chemicals out of your own control in the ambient air, for example, we do require a more stringent criteria. And that's why, you know, we use this 1 in a million value, although it's a very, very small risk. It's something, there's a very big difference between exposures that we put on ourselves versus exposures that are imposed on us without our control.
I understand what you're saying. That's a matter of personal viewpoints about risk, that none of us like to have risks that we didn't that agree to personally, correct?
Right.
In the context of issuing air permits, though, that's a decision that the agency has to make, correct?
Exactly.
And make all the time. It's a regulatory risk management decision, correct?
Exactly.
From a public health perspective, where you come from, any addition of risk is to be avoided, correct?
Yes, it's an interesting point you make. And from the public health perspective, for example, in my work, or in any of us working in public health research with humans, we have to be certified for human studies. And what does that mean? There is this basic tenet in studying humans of beneficence, which means doing good. And there are two corollaries to that, which we all have to be trained in and certified in. That is, one, do no harm, and I think we understand that. In this case, and the other is, it's necessary to do harm in some sense, then there should be some counterbalancing benefit that outweighs the harm to the participant. So in this case, I mean, the public health perspective or the ethical perspective would be minimize, if you cannot do no harm here, in this case, then at least minimize the harm to the population, minimize the risk to the population. And secondly, if
necessary to impose this risk on the population, then there should be some net benefit to the population also, for the people experiencing this harm. And I think there's a missed opportunity here in working with the communities to, I agree, the implication of this is that we could not build new facilities that are emitting this type of, these types of toxic pollutants. But
And then we should also put controls on traffic to not allow traffic counts to grow, right? On that logic.
in that sense, and so the public health perspective of this is, we need to take whatever actions we can to minimize those, or if we cannot minimize those, to try and counterbalance that with other actions that would, in some sense, improve the health of the population.
In your preparation for your testimony, did you review the modeling report that was done by Karen?
I did, yes.
And are you familiar with modeling reports of that sort?
It's been a long time since I've done it, but yes,
And you understand it's a dispersion model.
yes,
And you understand that what it is modeling is what's referred to earlier in the testimony as the maximum level of whatever that air toxic is over a 5-year span.
yes,
At a particular location.
right,
And that those maximum levels occur only at one particular location and then drop off away from there due to dispersion, right?
Is it?
yes.
So, in order to be, in order to be, receive a dose caused of an air pollutant emitted by the facility, you have to actually experience it, right? So if you're living 10 miles away
Yes.
from this facility, you're not going to experience the maximum level, correct?
Not knowing the specifics of where those maxima were occurring, but in general, I would agree with you.
So in fact, the maximum level is not going to be experienced all over the maximum level of the emissions from the facility is not going to be experienced all over the border area.
But by definition, the maximum is at some specific point at a specific time.
I have no further questions.
Does the department have questions for Dr. Dockery?
Thank you, Dr. Dockery. My name is MacDara Fallon. I represent Mass DEP. Thank you for your testimony submitted today. We appreciate it. We have reviewed it. We don't have any questions in addition to what you've already been asked for today, but we thank you for your testimony.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the work that the department has done.
Thank you.
Mr. Goldrosen,
Yes,
do
thank
you
you.
have any redirect?
Yes, I do. Dr. Dockery, you were presented with a copy of the 2017 guidelines and directed to the new wording, shall we say, of the paragraph on shoreline fumigation there.
Yes.
And during the cross-examination, I believe you were asked a question as to whether this paragraph refers to whether AMOD can be used for this. AMOD is not actually mentioned in that paragraph, is it?
Not explicitly.
So, the questions arose in your comment in your testimony arose in regard to the issue of shoreline fumigation, sea breeze condition, so things of that sort, correct?
Right.
And I believe you talked a bit about the difference between stack height and plume height, but I wonder if you could further explain what the distinction is and what the difference is. What difference does it make? And how does the airstream model or other models that can be used account for those differences?
Well, the objective, I guess, of a stack is to place the emissions from the facility far enough away vertically that it will, by the time it diffuses down to the surface where people are being exposed, it will be dispersed enough that the concentrations become small or negligibly small. And there are a couple ways that that can happen. You can raise the vertical height of the plume of those emissions. And one is by building a taller stack. So in the early 90s, in fact, when we were trying to control acid rain or control sulfur emissions, the solution was to build taller stacks, and converting from 250-foot stacks to 1,000-foot stacks at many of these power plants. That actually had the unanticipated, the effect of transporting more pollution up to New England. We developed acid rain problems with that. The other way to do that is to eject it at a higher velocity so it goes up farther, just of its own momentum. And the third factor is to have a high temperature for the exhaust so that the buoyancy, the hot air, makes the plume rise up. So it's the combination of all those things, and that is built into the models, into AirMod or any of the models we're talking about. That the physics of this are well known. So it's important to consider all the physical parameters of the model of the emissions here, as well as the stack height. Now, with regard to the sea breeze fumigation, what's happening is, as the air comes over the water, as we've discussed before, and especially at this time of year, is cold compared to the land. When the air moves over the land, it's heated from below by the hot surface, and that hot air is lighter than the cold air, and it sets up a convection. And as it gets warmer and warmer, that convection gets deeper and deeper, and you get a higher level of convection. So the process is, where does that convection, where you're getting this overturning of the atmosphere, intercept with the plume above? And in fact, when that happens, the plume starts flipping down, and you see this looping phenomena that we saw examples of yesterday in Dr. Phillips' testimony. So, I mean, that's the type of conditions that we see under these sea breeze fumigation conditions.
All right. And is the shoreline dispersion model a method for accounting for those characteristics?
Right, I think we've gotten a better understanding of this. The models have improved, presumably between 2011 and 2017, and indeed, I think Mr. Pacheco or Mr. Zikas did the calculations using the fumigation model. I mean, I do have some questions about the specific application there, but my point is that this is an important phenomenon that's been recognized for decades as an important consideration when you're locating a facility on the shoreline. And it's hard to imagine a facility that is not closer to the shoreline than this specific facility. And it was recognized in the earliest models, and recognized that the basic model does not incorporate this. But it has been incorporated into the newer models, and my point is this was not considered in the original calculations. It's a potential consideration specifically for the people in Braintree who are affected when the wind is coming off the ocean and under these sea breeze conditions. So at least for my constituency that I was working with, this is a specific consideration for them. They were being exposed, when they were being exposed, it would be under these sea breeze conditions.
And so in your review of the modeling report prepared for the applicant, it was your understanding that the shoreline dispersion model was not used at that point.
Right.
Is that correct? But based on the rebuttal testimony, I don't believe it's Mr. Chico's, it has been subsequently used by the department in response to the testimony that was received.
That was my reading of it, yes.
Do you have any comments on how it was applied by the department?
I did question some of the assumptions that were made, specifically Mr. Pacheco assumed that the shoreline was defined by the bay waters. I think his language was for the Hingham Bay and Quincy Bay and Hingham Bay, which is some mile or so away from the shore, whereas if you look at the picture, if you look at the map, the site is just a few hundred meters away from the shore. This is not a difficult calculation to make. And I think in Dr. Norgard's testimony, I think he was using a value of 130 meters possibly, which seemed like a much more reasonable value. So that is actually a critical parameter here, because that defines what the height of the boundary layer is and what the potential is then for intercepting the plume. And Mr. Pacheco argued that because this is only a 60-meter stack, this does not fall under the definition of a tall stack as specified here, ignoring the plume rise associated with the exit velocity and the buoyancy of the plume that was estimated, as I recall, is reported to be 850 to 999 degrees. So a very hot buoyant plume going to have much higher concentrated plume height. And the implication is that, in fact, when Mr. Pacheco modified the distance to the shoreline, in fact, he did find that as he got closer, and closer than 300 meters, in fact, he did find evidence of fumigation in the model being a necessary consideration.
Let me turn to the other part of your testimony that Attorney Charles was questioning you about the toxic gas pollutants. So to clarify, in paragraph 25, I believe you stated it, but I just want to clarify this. You were referring to air toxic, that's correct, as opposed to the criteria.
Yes, it's under the subheading of air toxics.
Right, you intended that, because just before paragraph 25, you have a whole subheading, and you intended that paragraph to refer to evaluating toxic effluent exposures, which is the title of the heading. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And then, as you stated, you acknowledge your experiences primarily with the criteria of pollutants. And so coming at this now and seeing how the department evaluates air toxics, you observe the difference between how what we would call guidelines, limits, standards, how they're applied.
Yes.
And I think you alluded to that in both your written testimony, but also in your response to cross-examination.
Indeed, when you look at the ambient criteria air pollutants, the process, there is a similar process for evaluating the impact of a single facility based on the significant impact level, which is defined as the impact level that the facility itself has. But this in some sense is similar to the approach taken regarding to looking at the incremental effect on the toxic air pollutants, the DELs or the AALs. In that case, though, there's three components of this. First of all, it only applies when the ambient levels are below the standards. So that's when the background levels are less than the standards already. In that case, the question is whether this new facility would increase the levels significantly within those presumably clean air already. Secondly, then the examination is made of how the emissions, the modeled impact of that facility compares to these SELs, which are set at a small fraction of the ambient air standard. And if they do not meet that criteria, then they are defined as being de minimis impacts and meet the criteria if you're moving ahead. If, however, they are above that, then the comparison is made to, well, would they raise the level above the expected, raise the expected level above the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So there's a multi-phase application, and including specifically thinking about at the first stage whether you're above the standard, whether the background levels are above the standard, and then ultimately whether the addition of this specific source would raise the exposures above that standard. So that's very different from the process here for the evaluation of the DEL guidelines or the AALs, where it's just looking at that incremental exposure and defining whether that is above the impact of the facility is above these DELs or AALs itself without considering the background concentrations. I just find that incongruous that we would have very, very different approaches to the way we evaluate criteria pollutants from toxic pollutants.
I have no further questions on
Any redirect, Mr. Cramb?
Very quickly, Dr. Dockery, you don't have any current experience regarding the selection of an appropriate model for applications when fumigation is expected to occur, correct?
No, I don't.
And then you didn't perform any modeling using any model to evaluate potential fumigation effects at the site of the proposed compressor station, correct?
No.
Thank you.
I mean, my point was, they said they were following these guidelines, and there seemed to be some difference between what they did and what the guidelines suggested.
Thank you.
Mr. Child, any redirect?
I have no further questions.
The department doesn't have any.
One response to follow up. Your testimony, when you say, you just said that the applicant or the department had not seemed to follow the guidelines that suggested using a model to account for fumigation. You're referring to your written testimony, pre-filed testimony, which was prepared before receiving the rebuttal testimony from the department.
Yes.
And the rebuttal testimony indicated that those models have now been used as part of the rebuttal testimony. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Thank you.
Department have any questions?
No.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
When we break for,
Did you introduce the
We did.
It's applicant 16. We will break for lunch. It's 22 minutes past 12. Let's be back here at 1:15, please.
If we have one moment with you with respect to what we say.
Yes. Attorneys Dingle and Fallon. Mr. Mayor, are you prepared?
I have no idea.
Mr. Hayden, you have a minute?
There would be like,
Mr. Hayden mentioned this morning they want to see if we can read on the data, which is that correct? Yes.
Is this pertaining to the
No,
other?
like,
Thank you.
More leeway than expected. Pontification.
Yeah, that was great. A lot of really good useful knowledge.
Yeah, it's more, right, I mean, that's what I'm used to doing. I was teaching how to.
That's what a good practice will do.
Oh, I mean, I thought you were terrific.
Thank you.
Limiting what you were going to